Hey y'all. So usually when you see a video on YouTube about the Poverty Point site, it either goes over kind of a synopsis of what the Poverty Point site is, or just kind of giving details about, the mound or something like that. This will not be one of those videos. Instead, what I'll be doing is giving you information that'll be part of future publications that should be coming out before too long about my research on the Poverty Point site. So this research originally started as part of my master's thesis at the University of Southern Miss. Since then, I've gradually been building upon that, and so I kind of wanted to share that information with the general public. So with that, let's get into some actual archaeology. So to begin, just in case you weren't familiar about Poverty Point is a multi-mound complex in northeastern Louisiana. It consists of 6 earthen ridges and 6 mound structures. It dates somewhere between 3,600 to 3,000 years before present. My analysis focused particularly on lithic material, so lithic raw material. So when I talk about lithic raw material, that's the type of stone that was used to produce stone tools. So part of my research were identifying the different types of raw material that were coming to Poverty Point to look at all of these areas that individuals were either gathering material from and bringing back, or were naturally around that area and were bringing it with them when they came to Poverty Point. The assemblage I looked at specifically was part of an excavation in 1995 as part of the field school under John Gibson. It focused on a few areas, but primarily on what we call as the North 3 ridge. So this is the third ridge and kind of the set of 6 earthen ridges on the north part of the site. What I was really curious about is how these assemblages lined up with Gibson's original proposal in the 1970s that these people were organized into a chiefdom level society. And these are kind of the things when you think about a typical traditional chiefdom as it's portrayed in that. And this would be that there were hierarchical leaders that were responsible for the construction of Poverty Point. It should be noted that Gibson had already moved away from that kind of hypothesis and looked more into a traditional, as we see now, a hunter-gatherer society were responsible for Poverty Point. And my original advisor at University of Southern Miss, Ed Jackson, had actually proposed that it was a trade fair, a location where different hunter-gatherer groups would come from all over, interact and trade, and then disperse back into their normal homeland locations. And we see this as it's somewhat the case. We do see a lot of material coming into Poverty Point that is from all over, copper from the Great Lakes, pottery from Georgia, Florida, stone from, as I'll get into later, all over the place. So I wanted to test these models to really see how accurately they fit up, just as a confirmation, or if that they weren't accurate, or if they were somewhat accurate or completely accurate. So one of the things that I did was, as I said, type the raw materials. And what I used were visual observations from a lithic comparative collection. So this lithic comparative collection, Phil Carr, who's currently at the University of South Alabama, and Lee Stewart had traveled throughout much of eastern North America to locate geological outcroppings where possible material from Poverty Point was coming from. In addition to the assemblage that I had examined, I also brought in previously examined assemblages, used the data that they had looked at, so that way it was more comprehensive. It wasn't just my one single set of artifacts trying to make an interpretation for the whole site. I included data from many previous examinations. And that's actually something we try to do in archaeology. Instead of just trying to make a hypothesis about what's going on based off a single structure or a single artifact or a single T-pillar. We try to use multiple data sets to come up with more accurate hypotheses about what's going on in the past. Originally, Gibson had separated the lithic raw materials into 8 different stone types. When I got the assemblage and I looked through it originally and did kind of a pilot study on the examination, I separated it into more than 20 different raw materials. And this was largely thanks to, as I mentioned earlier, the work that Phil Card had done in identifying all the possible, or most of the possible resources that individuals were gathering stone from to bring to Poverty Point. So one of the big things that I found is that a lot of the material coming from these excavations at the site were Burlington, and not just any type of Burlington. This is from the Ozarks. It's a low quality version of it. And when I looked at that compared to what previous archaeologists had seen in the assemblages they were looking at, it's kind of a consistent pattern. So Margaret Spivey also noted the high percentages of Burlington chert of low quality. And I saw a lot of that in my assemblage. And then previous excavations going all the way back to the 1950s noticed a low quality white material, a white exotic lithic material, which white is one of the big characteristics of Burlington chert. And so with that, it brought up a question. Do you have this just extraordinary site, the second largest mound in North America, and we have great high quality stone coming from other places, but at much lower percentages. So we have this huge abundance of low quality material. So one of the typical things, if you have low quality material, that you do to increase the likelihood that you'll be able to make a completed tool with it is you heat treat it. So this is a piece of Keokuk, which is originally it's a low quality piece of Keokuk. And what you see is this pink coloration. This means it was heat treated. And so with this heat treated piece, that increases the predictability of it breaking in a way that we want it to be broken. So, when I'm knocking a flake off, for example, I can more easily predict how that flake is going to come out and what it's going to look like. A lot of the Burlington at Poverty Point, though, isn't heat treated. It's just remained low quality material that traveled from hundreds of miles away and wasn't seen to be made or utilized in a way or prepared in a way to make it more likely that they would have a completed tool. And so with that, I looked into some other aspects. Margaret Spivey had also previously looked at that and found that high quality Burlington is actually closer to the site. So we did a least cost path analysis. So that's the energy expenditure or time or things like that it takes to get from one location to the next. So think about your modern Google or Apple Maps, and you put it in and you want, the quickest way from point A to point B. That's a least cost path analysis. She had determined that the least cost, it would have cost less for high quality Burlington to get to the Poverty Point site. And so I ran a similar analysis, but I didn't just run it on Burlington. I ran it on many different types of material. And Burlington is one of the somewhat more difficult ones to get to the site. So not only do we have low quality material showing up to the site that doesn't seem to be prepared to make completed tools, we also see it's one of the most difficult to get to Poverty Point. And so this brings up a lot of questions. The main one being, why? So I myself, as I've mentioned before, and you can probably tell from the stuff around you, flint knap. When I first started flint knapping, I wasn't given the high quality material. I wasn't given the obsidian or Georgetown flint. I was given untreated Keokuk to use. So then I could start to learn how to just strike a piece of material. So with that in my mind, I decided that one of the big values that hadn't really been pushed on kind of these hypotheses and things like that are what are indigenous perspectives about the role of the material, the site, and different things like that. Well, through both looking at ethnographic studies and going out and speaking to different indigenous communities myself, we see that that is kind of a pattern, that low quality material is used as a form of teaching. You know, you may have children or just novice viewers, but it goes beyond that. We see it as a form of community building. So after that, I decided to do some experimental archaeology. I would want to really shout out Go Napping. They provided the material for me to conduct these experiments, and I tested it with an individual named Gerald Franklin, who is a longtime student, retired rancher of archaeology, just a huge enthusiast, and honestly a role model not only for archaeological enthusiasts, but archaeologists and just anyone interested in the past. Together, we napped out untreated, heat-treated Burlington to look at the variations of patterns we can see in the flakes to see if we can identify novice people napping them. So Gerald, I had, as my study sample, I had registered as the kind of expert, an individual that knew what he was doing. I was the intermediate. This was several years ago, and I still wouldn't call myself an expert in flint napping, but I thought I would be someone of an intermediate skill set. And then I had material from novices, people who hadn't done it before, had done it less than a handful of times, and then examined that material in comparison to the material that we were finding at Poverty Point. And it turns out that a lot of these signs that previous archaeologists had argued for were ways to identify novice people trying to flint nap were seen both confirmed in my experimental archaeology assemblage, but also in the assemblage that I had found at Poverty Point. So this brought in some new things. If there's a sense of community building, which is a huge part of indigenous culture to begin with, what does that really tell us about the Poverty Point culture? And at the time, this was beyond me. I'll be honest. I didn't understand enough at the time to really grasp a lot of what I was seeing. But thanks to the work of individuals at Jaketown, so T.R. Kidder, who's a huge name in Poverty Point studies, Grace Ward, Seth Grooms, and Andrew Scholes, they saw that from the excavations at Jaketown and the background and other things they had already known from working at the Poverty Point site, that we're probably, instead of seeing this whole one unified culture, we're seeing smaller communities coming together, kind of vesting into this Poverty Point tradition. So now this makes sense. If we're seeing a lot of stone material that isn't high quality and seems to be more of a throwaway material where you're just napping it to nap it, and you're really using this stuff to build a group of identity of camaraderie among the different groups that are traveling to Poverty Point, because based on this map, just based on where the stone's coming from, these are communities hundreds and hundreds of miles from each other. And so, to me at least, it makes sense that these activities would be occurring to help form a sense of togetherness. And we see that time and time again in indigenous culture, and that's one of the big reasons it's so important in archaeological research to get indigenous perspectives on things. It's important for us to talk to indigenous cultures, archaeologists from wherever, because once we do that, we can answer these questions better. So that's it. It's not a this changes the whole history of Poverty Point, but it is another marker of how we're ever growing and learning more about the ancestral indigenous people of North America, and how using different data sets are helping us confirm, or at least it seems more accurate that these interpretations are correct. So big thank you to all of you for listening. Like I said, this isn't a big, groundbreaking, changing discovery for Poverty Point, but the work that's been done at Jaketown by the individuals I mentioned earlier is super fascinating. I would encourage all of you to check that out. If you're trying to get into flint napping or already into flint napping, I'd recommend going to checking out Go Napping. They have starter kits and things like that, and they've been tremendously helpful to me in the past about helping further archaeological research. And then thank you. I want to take time to thank all of you. My channel's been growing. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping to continue to share this kind of information with y'all. And hopefully with this is another thing is I want to make, like I said, this information is eventually going to be published. Hopefully one coming out relatively soon, the other one maybe in a year. But I want to make this information to the public, and that's one of my big goals with this, is taking this information and sharing it with y'all. So I really appreciate the time if you view this. If you haven't, please like and subscribe. That helps me, and as like I said, I'm a growing channel, and just really appreciate this, and I hope this helps kind of look more past just the Poverty Point site itself and think about the people, because that's one of the most fascinating things to me, is the people behind all this, and the things that they were doing is just extraordinary. And so once again, thank y'all, and y'all have a good one.